So hi everybody and welcome to episode 70 of Level Up. 60 minutes, as you know, of live Q&A where your questions, chats, comments and votes really do drive the show. So please, I can already see quite a lot of you joining us online, both on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So just introduce yourselves, please, in the chat over there. I think Charlotte Miller is online today for us and she's handling the social interaction in the chat. So let us know your name, please, and whereabouts in the world you're joining from in the chat. We love to hear from you and we'll get everybody involved in the show. Also in the chat, of course, you will soon find a link to vote up the questions that you would most like answered. And of course, to add your own. We live stream Mondays at 8 and Fridays at 2 p.m. every week, UK time, to both YouTube and LinkedIn. Now, today, we're going to be talking about the winning formula for public-private partnerships, or PPPs, as they are abbreviated to. Now, they're a global growth vehicle, as we know, for delivering not just large infrastructure projects, but also a whole range of service-led public-private partnerships are now in place by different governments around the world. So how do you improve your personal chance of success in being involved and your organizations in bidding for and executing excellence? Well, we've got a highly experienced panel today, so let's jump across and meet them. Everybody is returning to the Level Up panel today. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Maurice. Maurice Diamond has a background in complex procurement and commercials. He's a leading tutor and coach for the World Bank CP3P qualifications and delights in seeing his clients improve their project procurement and management skills. Welcome, Maurice.
Thank you.
And whereabouts are you joining us from, Maurice, today?
So I'm pleased to tell you that I'm joining from London, which is pretty sunny. You can see the light coming in the background, and I'm looking forward to some challenging questions for us today.
Right, okay, very good. Thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see you again. Richard Foster has a background in law and has worked in the state PPP unit of Victoria in Australia. Foster Infrastructure, which is his business, focuses on providing commercial and risk management advisory services. Welcome back, Richard. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly even though it's a public holiday here in Australia. I'm glad to be inside as the weather isn't quite as nice as it is in London.
Ah, okay, all right. Well, it's usually the opposite way around. We're usually a little envious of the weather that you folks are enjoying day to day. But welcome back again. Lovely to see you, Andre Kruger. He's the Chief Operating Officer over at PPP Training Online, and as an ex-banker, has great experience of public sector credit risk structuring and evaluating PPP transactions. A strong supporter of Level Up, Andre focuses on building confident and capable PPP practitioners. Welcome back, Andre. Great to see you.
Hi, Nick. Good morning, and good morning to all the listeners. We are really looking forward to a very informative session today. I am, for the rest of the week, based here in Ghana, in Accra. Temperatures of, when I landed here yesterday evening, it was 29 degrees coming from South Africa, where we had, I think when I left, 10 degrees. It was quite a culture shock. But yeah, it's actually nice and warm.
How lovely. It's really, yeah, it's really nice when you go from the cold of the kind of winter time, into a more moderate or temperate climate. So that's really lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome back. Sergei, Samolis is the CEO, of course, of PPP Expertise Eurasia. They're a leading provider of CP3P training in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and in the Balkans. Sergei also shares a banking background and has worked on major deals across a wide variety of sectors. So welcome back, Sergei. Really nice to see you.
Morning, Nick. Hello, everyone. Happy to greet everyone.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And completing our panel today is Amandeep. Amandeep Singh Virk is a leading PPP transaction advisor, currently working with the World Bank. Amandeep has experience, of course, of the full life cycle of public-private partnerships, from conceptualization all of the way through to evaluation. So it's great to have you on today's show. Of particular interest to him is sustainability in development, and knowledge transfer, I think it's fair to say, like all of the panel, is a bit of a personal passion. So welcome back, Amandeep. Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Nick, and hello, everyone. And pleased to be back on this panel, such an engaging panel on discussions on PPP. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, fantastic. And of course, the show would not be complete without our question master for today, who is Suchitra Jacob. And Suchitra is joining us from Bangalore in India. So welcome, Suchitra. How are you?
Hi, everyone. I'm doing well. Thank you. Joining in from Bangalore in India.
Okay, excellent. And I can see some folks. We've got people from Cape Town in South Africa. We've got the Thames Valley in the UK. Irene has joined from Uganda. We've got folks from Ethiopia. Ayadel from London. We've got people in Tanzania, throughout Africa, actually. Africa's really well represented today as a continent. So thank you, everybody, for joining us online. Suchitra, I think we should get right into it. And may we have our first question, please?
Question from Lucas Reek. Should governments develop a long-term plan, plus or minus 10 years, that includes a project list of projects to be procured on a traditional or PPP basis?
Okay, Andre, your hand was up really quickly for this. So why don't you start us off, and then we'll hear from Amandeep.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Suchitra. Yeah. So very important. So when we talk about the success of PPP projects, what we are actually saying that it's all about a longer term process. It's we spoke a little bit about earlier about project management, the planning, etc. So this success is really born from proper planning over the long term. Integrated planning between the legal guys, the technical guys, the finance guys in government. It's actually quite important for them to integrate their needs. The technical people will set based on population growth, etc., will set the long-term plans, capital planning based on their capital management, etc. And the financial guys will have to look into that. So in short, we absolutely need these longer term plans to integrate and to allow governments to timeously start developing these projects that their communities may need in years to come. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much indeed. Amandeep, your thoughts then, Richard?
All right. So this is, to be short, this identification of the right project, a suitable project, whether it is PPP on PPP procurement or the traditional procurement, it was one of the first key milestone to get a success on PPP. And government should which are not being, most of the government doesn't, but should pay attention to this right selection of the project. And we call it a mechanism. This is a public investment management, and selection should be through that, where you rightly select, okay, there may be 100 wish list of the projects in different departments, ministries, and now you have to choose the right project to be taken to a right procurement process, which project is suitable. So public investment management, looking at your overall resources and the suitability of the project, you select a project whether to take it through the PPP procurement or through the public procurement. And more so, this builds a trust in the market for a particular government or country. Okay, so what it spells out, okay, this government means business. They have a good pipeline of projects, and these, out of the, say, 100 pipeline projects, they have identified these 5 priority projects to be taken next 1 or 2 years. So this builds a trust in the both investor and the lenders, and it's very important. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. You did some really good points there about confident government and how confident government inspires confidence in the market. Richard, and then Sergei, please.
Yes, the only thing I would add, I think Andre and Amandeep have covered it very well. The one thing I would add would be that if you do have an independent infrastructure planning agency that effectively provides advice to governments on long-term infrastructure priorities, that's a very powerful tool for overcoming some of the short-term political problems that we see where with changes in government, infrastructure priorities chop and change. If you have an independent advisory body that advises on longer term priorities and makes those public, then that can really break you out of the short term political volatility that can occur.
It's a really good point, that, isn't it? Because politicians have a certain life cycle. Elections come around with remarkable frequency, sometimes higher frequency than the politicians might even like for themselves. But there we go. Thank you very much indeed. Great thoughts, Sergei, and then Maurice.
Many of the points I had in mind were just covered by previous panelists. Maybe one thing only to add is such a plan would be a long-term one, and it would have a list of projects prioritized, most likely. But I think it's essential that every year the government revisits this list, because priorities may change, and the value for money or any other kind of assessments for an investment decision and procurement decision could be done every time. So you may have put a certain project on your priorities list 5 years ago. Now it's time to procure it. You may have thought it would be a good PPP, but it should not be biased to either traditional or PPP way. You need an assessment the time you intend to carry on with this project, and maybe this assessment will say, no, we rather should take it as a traditional procurement, or we may need to, cancel the project after all. So though there is a plan, it is to be approved every time you carry on with a new project.
Interesting. It's a balance, really, isn't it, between having that long-term vision, setting that strategy, and inspiring confidence to other people's points, and then actually, there are genuine times when you need to revisit the business case. Maurice, final thoughts on this?
So, I absolutely agree with all the comments that have been made. So what would I add to it? Well, I often talk about the fact that every country should have an economic plan. And I think what we're talking about here is that economic plan. Richard mentioned the independent organization that should be helping us to understand what that plan should be. And of course, there will be political inputs at times. And of course, those political inputs will change either by election or party. And just stressing that point about revisiting the plan. And not also, and I think this is a last point, not getting stuck into saying that this is a PPP project or this is a traditionally procured project. We should have one plan, and that plan should be under continual assessment. Thank you.
It's really interesting, because you're so right. Many of these projects, whether they be infrastructure based or whether they be, service led, they have a generational time scale to them. And so therefore they're going to live beyond the present moment, beyond the present government, beyond the present officers, if you like, of the politicians who are taking those decisions on a day-to-day basis on behalf of citizens. And so in that regard, knowing the direction of travel is super important, and at the same time being able to make the right decision at the right time on behalf of citizens to say, no, actually, we're going to own this. It won't be a PPP project because that makes sense and that's going to deliver the best value. Or alternatively, actually, no, on this occasion, this vehicle is completely the right way to do it. And these are the reasons why. And I think as people mature more in their use of a variety of different funding mechanisms and execution mechanisms, that becomes clearer for people, and it becomes more self-evident as to which of those projects make more sense. So really interesting start to our event today. Thank you so much, Lucas, for a brilliant question. If you're watching online, and I can see many of you are, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to put your question directly to the panel, just type it in the chat. And in a moment or two's time, we'll bring it into the show for you and get you an answer straight away. Suchitra, in the meantime, let's take our next question, please.
Question from Rachel. With expanding public debt in many countries, PPPs seem like the answer. But when is a PPP structure not advisable?
Oh, this could be a fairly lengthy answer, actually. There's a whole variety of reasons as to why you may not wish to, go down this kind of route in order to be able to start off and finance and fund and execute. Amandeep, let me come to you first this time, then we'll hear from Maurice next.
No, it's a good question. So public debt is always a worry in developing countries, and the PPP structure or the PPP. So first of all, we need to understand PPP is not a miracle. It's just another form of procurement of an infrastructure or a services, right? So when a government is already debt, I talked about in the last question regarding the public investment management, right? So in the public investment management, if a government is looking at, okay, our resources are up to the mark and we can't take on or cross subsidize the project or subsidize the project, and that is the moment when you see to check which is the right, if it is a PPP, what is the right PPP structure you look at. If a project is a self-sustainable, meaning by through user charges, and there's no requirement of government subsidy or VGF, how it calls, then you can take a chance to go ahead for that project, still looking at the contingent liabilities that project may bring on. However, any project which needs a government subsidy or government pay PPP in a country where debt is already overboard may not be a right structure to take forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Maurice and then Andre.
Okay, thank you. One of the issues that I always have when people are looking at PPP or traditional routes is that they bounce them around as if you're playing ping pong. But the fact is that PPP is far more complex than a traditional procurement. There are issues around whether or not the economy is right, is the investment market appropriate, and so on. If the environmental factors are not in place, then a PPP is not going to work. For some countries, there is no resource available, in the financial resource, and they have to go down a PPP route. But in similar countries, it may be that nobody would even want to bid for those projects. So those upfront initial assessments, beyond whether it's the right project, are so important. That market assessment and intervention, who's going to bid for this? And also, is it going to be affordable? All those key basic points in the business case have to be absolutely spot on. And that means probably that there are a lot of projects that are being presented as PPP that shouldn't be, because there are areas which are not appropriate. But can I just say that just because a business case might not give you the right answer, it doesn't mean to say you should stop there. And maybe the facts are that you have to look at different ways of structuring your projects in order to make them work if they have to be a PPP. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. Yeah. And you make a really good point about, reflecting on the outcome of business case development and where it leads you, and causing you then to, think differently perhaps about, the way in which you structure the project itself or the program or project. Thank you very much indeed, Maurice. Andre and then Sergei.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. So the points made obviously very important. Maybe a practical example, liking the idea of bringing things practical. In Uganda, the PPP unit has taken the lead, and well, let me first just color it in a little bit. So they've been looking at PPPs at the national level, and now they are looking at PPPs at the next sphere or a level of government in the municipal local government space. So they've appointed transaction advisors, and when they put out the documents, they said, listen, please go out to the transaction advisors, go and identify potential projects, and with you we will sort of decide, at least at a conceptual level, which projects should suit the PPP procurement model. Very interesting. They've identified 100, 200 projects initially from a list of municipalities. They are down to 20 now. So So the size of a project. Is there any commercial rationale to the project? And I won't go into all of these. But the whole idea is that in the end, they will identify 4, because it will be the first time that municipalities in Uganda will be thinking about developing projects on PPP basis. They will bring it down to 4 or maybe 8 of them, and then focus on those and see PPP unit in a advisory mode. Will then see if they can assist in making those projects, building the bankability, the feasibility. Yeah, thank you.
And I think that's a really important part of this. You know, PPPs don't always work at a national level, but they may work at a more local level, at a state level, or at a more local government level, and they may make a lot more sense and actually get more buy-in from people when they are more tailored in that way to delivering an outcome for citizens, which makes more sense on a local level and perhaps less sense overall at a national level. So really important point. Thank you very much indeed, Andre. Sergei, your thoughts on this?
My thoughts, looking at the question, the question establishes a link between the public debt and whether to go for PPPs or not. If PPPs are seen as a way of dealing with public debt or circumventing public debt. So I think one of the perspectives on this question is, how do you treat PPPs in terms of, is it reflected in the national accounts? Does it give you, is it a good motivation to go for PPPs just to make sure that the public debt or borrowing capacity is not affected? And I would say it's an area where a lot of caution is required. And Amandeep mentioned contingent liabilities. That's something we are involved in now as advisors in one of the Central Asian countries, which really expanded its PPP portfolio. And it's happening in the region, in some other countries. And only now, after dozens of deals were announced and signed, only now the government is trying to assess, so how much of public debt, how much of liabilities have we accumulated in terms of annual payments, let alone the contingent ones. So it could be a dangerous situation, and we've seen some of the countries with major PPP programs already being hit by macroeconomic shocks. You could think of Turkey and these very ambitious, wonderful hospital PPP programs really hit in terms of direct and contingent liabilities. So one need to be very cautious about that.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because for many years, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but for many years, there was a sense of governments approaching public finance on a cash accounting basis, that revenues that were raised within the period were spent within the period, and there was very little in the way of creative thinking beyond that. And then over many years since the 1930s, governments have sought ever more creative ways to move some of that liability kind of out of the day-to-day cash in, cash out, and onto various different financial instruments. So it's a really good point, Sergei, and just at the moment as well, a very topical one, in the sense that interest rates are rising generally around the world. There are inflationary pressures, and the cost of servicing all of that debt is increasing quite rapidly as well. And affordability will now come back into the equation again in perhaps a different way, to the one that we have seen, or at least the era that we've been in Western Europe for the more recent period, last 10 years or so, where interest rates generally have been quite low. Okay, well, let's move on. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Rachel, for really interesting and insightful question. Everybody thinking this morning. And thank you so much, everybody who's joining us online. Suchitra, let's move on to our next question, please.
We have a live question from Thomas. Should a government have a PPP law in place to ensure the project's attraction to bidders?
Why don't you start us off on this one?
Okay, I find this a very interesting question because I started my PPP career here in Australia. where we don't have a PPP law, and yet we regard it as a PPP success story. When I first started talking to people in other countries about PPPs, often they'd ask me, "Oh, can you give us a copy of your PPP law?" And I'd be scratching my head thinking, what are you talking about? What is a PPP law? Well, what I've learnt over time is that in fact there is benefit in having a PPP law for exactly the reason that Thomas in his question suggests. In many countries, the private sector wants to know that government is committed and serious about PPPs, and the private sector wants to have clarity about the rules of the game. And a PPP law can do that. A PPP law can provide greater certainty to bidders. It can provide real clarity of what the rules are for doing PPPs. And in addition, if we look at countries like Bangladesh, Bangladesh has a similar legal system in many ways to Australia. And so therefore they could have done their PPPs perhaps without a PPP law, but they effectively put in place a PPP law. One of the key reasons for their PPP law was to set up the right set of institutions for doing PPPs, to set up their central PPP unit. So that's another thing that a PPP law can do for you.
Thank you very much. It comes back to that early remark, wasn't it, from the panel about building confidence. You know, confident government leads to confidence in the market, and legislation provides a framework for the confidence to hold on to the stormier times. Let me put it that way. Very good. Thank you, Richard. Great answer. Amandeep, please, and then Maurice.
No, I think you rightly said this builds a confidence. Although, as Richard mentioned, like Australia, India also don't have a PPP law at the national level. Still, it's regarded as one of the successful PPPs in the world. But at the same time, where PPP law brings trust level in the market, especially the developing economies. Just to keep it short, it's very important.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Maurice?
So I actually am one of these people that, although I'm in the UK and we don't have a PPP law, I agree with Richard, it's extremely helpful. It's extremely helpful in a very complex world where a lot of private sector organisations are not familiar with the workings of particular countries, and they are therefore looking for a PPP law. If they see that there's a PPP law in a particular country, then that will be the start of their journey on whether or not they're going to bid for a particular project. But I would like to just give two warnings. I was working in a Southeast Asian country a few years ago, and they had a PPP law, wasn't quite named that, and they also had a law around infrastructure development. Now, one of those laws allowed tax breaks, and the other one didn't. The consequence was there was complete confusion in that country, and it meant that no PPPs happened at all until it was understood what was going on and the law was repealed. And just one other, which is also, this one is actually a funny story, and again, I won't mention the country. I was working in the Middle East in a particular country. They had enacted a PPP law, and in the PPP law, it said that there should be no changes in a PPP contract. It was actually illegal to have changes in a PPP contract. And they wondered why nobody was bidding for any of their projects. So we looked into why this had happened. What did this actually mean? Where did it come from? And it was because the person who had helped write the law had been working in the UK. And he had been working in the one of the cabinet office units that used to deal with PPP, Infrastructure UK, and they had a mantra, and their mantra was, you must not have contract change in PPPs. But what they meant was, please keep the changes down to the minimum you can, because any changes in any contract will cost money, and ever more so in a PPP contract. So they just had a mantra that was misunderstood by the individual, and then it got enacted into law. And of course, then that had to be repealed. And therefore, You just have to remember it can take a little bit longer to deal with changes in the law, so to speak. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. It's a kind of situation, isn't it, where the legislature is challenged in both directions. you kind of need to think through the unintended consequences sometimes of putting things into legislation. Great answers, thank you very much indeed, panel, and a wonderful question, Thomas. Thank you so much. Now, there was a kind of follow-up question to that, which was sort of related to it. So I'm just going to touch on that topic right now verbally. So the PPP law itself, does everything have to be in law, or can you have governance frameworks, if you like, which are outside of the legislation but the accepted practice? So I'm getting some nods from the panel. Richard, is that a fair blend to go for ultimately? Some legislation with some accepted practice in terms of a governance framework, perhaps?
That's absolutely correct. One mistake, and it goes to some of the discussion we just had, one mistake is that some PPP laws go too far in prescribing how PPPs are to be procured, what the contracts are to contain, and so on. So you find yourself with a PPP law in some countries says you can only do PPPs with these particular types of contracts. And when you run a tender process, you can only run your tender process in this one particular way. And they're not necessarily suitable for all projects. So it is better to provide a significant degree of flexibility, particularly in relation to things such as the types of contracts allowed under the law, the types of tender processes that you're allowed to run, and so on.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Some great questions there from our live audience. So thank you very much indeed to everybody out there. Suchitra, let's move on then, if we can, please, and we'll take our next question.
We have another live question from Mohammed. Some developing countries are embracing visions for 2030. What is the key role of PPPs for such visions?
Quite a broad question, this really, Mohammed. And depending on the country that you're in, governments will and leaders will kind of envision their future view, if you like, in different ways and via different mechanisms, I suppose. I think certainly from my perspective, working with colleagues around the world, is that it's great to have a vision which is, as we started the show, which has, a horizon of at least 10 years to be able to work to. Certainly in my country, here in the UK, we struggle with large infrastructure projects. We struggle with getting agreement to execute on them. And when we do execute on them, generally, it can take us some time for them to gather pace and to deliver, the value back to citizens again. I've just been very open and very open and honest. I think when it's done very well, but it's just my perception. That's all. Panel, and your thoughts, please, on this. What are your thoughts around having PPPs having a key role in delivering a future vision? Who would like to pick that up for us? Andre, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Nick. And I just an analogy here. It's the same for sporting teams. Those that may have not been successful probably will reset a new vision, a new strategy. And as you have correctly referred to, the first question also related to this long-term planning. So this is actually a very good question. We need, as a country, to have a vision. Not having a vision makes the long-term planning a bit more tough. Because should we prioritize social projects? Should we prioritize commercial type power projects? That's a huge focus all across the world. So in short, PPPs could really, for these longer in the longer term plans, PPPs could play a significant role in helping countries to attain their long-term strategies. So PPPs have got a definitive role to play.
Thank you very much indeed, Maurice, and then Richard.
Thank you. So we have to remember that with PPPs, what we're really doing here is looking at one of a number of ways of contracting. And part of this will be through that economic plan that we mentioned earlier. And part of it will be through the political aspirations of different parties and so on, and what they're trying to achieve. For example, a larger or a smaller civil service, public service. So how are we going to deliver our services in the future? So that's the step before we say, is it going to be a PPP? Are we going to have more privately delivered services or more publicly delivered services? And what do the stakeholders, what do the public think about that? Now, all of these things will depend on a particular country. But one of the things that's important is that please don't over-define PPP. Things change over time. I think, Nick, you mentioned this before. PPPs, we've been talking about a particular kind of PPP. But PPPs can work on a local basis. You can have social enterprises delivering local PPPs. For example, water can be dealt with locally. Then we can have regional style PPPs and then national style PPPs. And by breaking the PPPs down in this way, we can make them more effective in achieving the objectives, particularly in a developing country. And if you want an example of how this works well, look at WaterAid. WaterAid is a global charity. They have different organizations in different countries, but each country works with this sustainable model of PPPs. And I would hope that that broader approach to public-private partnerships is something that could be used in developing countries and indeed would be less costly for them as well.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I would actually extend it further and go beyond the traditional. We tend to focus on the traditional need for small projects in developing countries, but actually I think that intimacy between the true partnerships of if I can introduce yet another sector into this, just to make it more complicated, the tripartite grouping where you have government, universities, and local industry and commerce all coming together is a fantastically enabling. I'm not sure if that's very good English, but I'm hoping you're getting my enthusiasm for this, where you can create the circumstances in which true innovation happens on a local level. And it's a magical thing when you see people working in this way and they start to deliver real tangible benefits for citizens. Final thoughts on this, Maurice, before we move on.
So, I just wanted to mention, picking up on what you're saying, development impact bonds, social impact bonds, as they're known in other countries, is a really good example of this triangular approach. They are normally very small, relatively short-term projects, but they are difficult to put together. And just like a major PPP requires a lot of expertise, and people shouldn't skimp on, putting these things in place. But absolutely, this local solution, using local communities and getting people to identify with those solutions might be the way out of some of the problems that some countries have got into, and particularly the UK, where the public and indeed some of the employees don't feel that they're involved in that public-private partnership. For them, there is no partnership.
Yeah, entirely understand. So if you're watching us online and you'd like us to explore a little bit more on those sort of smaller projects, the more intimate projects where people come together in order to solve more local problems, then just let us know in the comments and we'll schedule, a future episode to explore all of that area. It's quite interesting. It'd be great to hear from some folks who are working for NGOs who also have a traditional role in delivering these kinds of outcomes. So Fascinating. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And what a great question. So thank you, Mohammed. You've really got us kind of thinking. We've gone off in a little slightly different direction to your original question, but we hope very sincerely that we've been able to give you a thorough answer to it. So excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Suchitra. Let's move on now, please, and we'll take our next question if we can.
Question from Tom. Do you have any guidance on how to mitigate the risk of corruption?
It's a good question, Tom. Richard, start us off on this one.
In the PPP context, corruption is most likely to occur during the tender process, or likely to have the greatest impact during the tender process. And there are two particular types of corruption that you might see there. You might see the private sector colluding amongst themselves, for example, all agreeing to increase their prices and then perhaps sharing amongst themselves a bit of excess revenue. Or you might have the form of corruption where government is actually involved and there is someone on government side who is in some corrupt arrangement with a bidder. Both these types of corruption can be addressed to a significant extent by having the right assurance and integrity processes in place as part of your PPP framework. And one of the things that I've seen that is particularly valuable there is independent scrutiny at particular points throughout the PPP process. For example, you can have a process where at particular points in a project's life cycle, independent people are asked to come in and they're given access to the project team, they're given access to documentation, and they take a look at what's going on and they make an assessment. Does it appear that everything here is being done in a fair and transparent manner? And if those people have no financial interest in the outcome, in the sense that they're not bidding for the project, they're not part of the government team who are involved in making decisions, then they're much more difficult to involve in any sort of corrupt conduct. And indeed, more generally, the more people are involved in something, the more difficult it is for corruption to take root, typically. Corruption thrives where there are small groups of people able to influence outcomes. Now, you might think this idea of getting independent people to come in and look at a project, isn't that going to be costly? Well, it might cost a little bit to pay for someone independent to come in and look at your project. Maybe on a $100 million project, you spend $100,000 having independent people look at your project. That's 0.1% increase in your project cost. But if corruption on average is costing you 10% on all of your projects across the board, then the return on investment for a little bit of investment in preventing corruption, return on investment is fantastic. So I think a lot of governments could do a lot more in actually investing in these measures to ensure integrity, and having independent scrutiny is a key way of doing that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. Sergei, your thoughts, please.
Thinking of PPPs, we often discuss their merits and their issues because these are big projects, and there is a lot of theory on theorizing big. The issues with these multi-billion, often projects with huge transformational impacts. There are a lot of disadvantages for a big project. It's difficult to manage, but I think PPP as a procurement instrument itself is it has the feature of being visible. It's big, but it's visible because there are so many parties. Particularly if it's a bid open for international competition. So we have compared traditionally procured project, at least in the geographies that we mainly operate. You probably would never hear anything about it. You would have a huge road being built, and you would never even know whether there was corruption involved or not. But when you have an open international bidding system, there's a level of transparency. And of course, when you have lenders, let's just focus on one party, lenders, and these could be international financial institutions, this could be international commercial banks. So there's a new layer of oversight of the project, which really helps with mitigating corruption. And of course, as Richard said, the process, of course, is really important. And in PPPs, by and large, there are more stringent disciplines on third parties present during public consultations. It may be independent or even other agencies from the government, people who would not be the procuring authority, but let's say the finance ministry, the judiciary, the law, Ministry of Justice, people may be present at the bid award panel. So there is layers of instruments to try to mitigate the risk of corruption in PPPs that may not be at the same level present in the traditionally procured infrastructure project.
Yeah, some really insightful and experienced points being brought up by the whole panel. Maurice, your thoughts on this? Maybe share some of your experience.
So one of the things I do is oversight on projects, and I come in at different points on a project when I'm being asked, and I have discovered there are two things. There's the kind of thing that Sergei's talking about, where you would not necessarily find, you just don't see any of this corruption. But there's also a certain amount of naivety. I was working in a country that Andre has worked in regularly, and he may even know these people, so I'm not going to name them. And I went to a meeting. I was working for USAID, and I was invited back into a negotiation meeting where we were to discuss the price of the project. So this is a nice PPP way to work. We have the business case, everything's open and so on. And the chief executive of the bidding organization, who at this point had managed to get themselves into the position of being the sole bidder, after I was introduced why I was there, he said, "Mr. Diamond, I'm sorry to inform you that this is not the way that we do business in this country. I met with my brother, the permanent secretary, last week, and we've already agreed a price." And the amazing thing for me was that he was so upfront about it. But the nice thing for me was that he told me to go back to my hotel. Well, he told me to fly back to the UK. There were no flights for a week. So I stayed in a lovely hotel with a lovely swimming pool. And USAID, their only concern was that I reported this particular incident back to them. It was not for me to act on. It was for me to report it back to those sponsors for them to deal with that. And I think that is also an important point, because they are far more experienced in dealing with those matters than the guy on the ground, who's quite vulnerable, actually. That was all I wanted to add.
I think it's a good point, because the integrity that's needed in these situations is considerable, and there's no choice in the matter. You either have integrity or you don't, and quite rightly, there should always be a difference between discovering, finding out, and reporting on incidents of concern. And indeed, the opposite is also true of things which are going really well, and being able to do that independently of those people then who need to engage in order to be able to, improve a situation that is worsening, or indeed, to reach out and to praise and recognize the excellent work that is going on. Because in all of these situations, there are invariably multiple kind of layers to these things. So thank you very much for sharing that very real world experience. And I've seen colleagues online today as well sharing their real world experience and their perception as well. So very good. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Suchitra, time flies, and I think we're coming up to close to the finish. But I think we can finish one by fitting in one more question if we can. So let's take our last question for today, please.
Question from Avery. What is your key piece of advice for ensuring the success of a PPP?
Amandeep, start us off first, please.
All right. So this is important in the sense that, as we discussed, PPP is a complex animal, and any one mistake on the whole process cycle made can make a project failure. So we need to be very careful right from the beginning. As you know, Maurice talked about the PPP framework or regulatory framework need to be perfect, not to be too prescriptive, not to be very hindrance. Next comes to this: have a good suitable pipeline. Selection of identification and screening of project is much more important. That's the foundation of success of any PPP project. And next point comes when you prepare a project. The business case need to be very much robustness, looking at the both viability, bankability, contingent liabilities, public investment management, everything in place, climate. So not just for the sake of making a business case, but a real business case and the structuring. Then, as we discussed in the last question, fair and transparent transaction process, no corruption. So we talked about various mechanisms to tackle corruption. Yes, can work, but in some cases, when everyone is against you, so it's sometimes difficult even to manage with all those mechanisms. But that is a key to success. If you keep it transparent, fair, the whole process, it means you are having a queue of investors lined up for your country or the region. So the trust is being built. Even in the one project, you made some mistake in a transaction, or even the structuring itself is not good. So you're closing doors for the market. So every step is very important in the whole life cycle of PPP to make it success. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Great advice there. Andre, your thoughts, please, and then Richard.
Yeah, and we have had a great intro to this question, dealing with all the various areas. So I can add to that is the project management teams. We have seen some projects where there is problems later on in the project, and the core issue is that the project team initially was not strong enough. They will appoint transaction advisors, and the transaction advisors will really bulldoze through the feasibility study, whereas the project management team that must actually recommend this project to their leaders is not strong enough to actually take the lead. So I cannot overemphasize the fact that we need strong teams. And then it's not only the project management team, it's also the contract management team. So once we have now procured a project and we have appointed a winning bidder, that contract management team need to be up and running very fast. The theory of the CP3P program suggests that we appoint a project manager, a contract manager, already before we go to market with the RFP processes. So just that focus, absolute focus on the stronger the government teams, project management, contract management, that will go a long way. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard.
Amandeep has talked about the complexity of the PPP process and the importance of getting all those tasks right. Andre has talked about the need for the right teams and the strength of the team to be able to do that. One thing we do still need to be aware of, though, is that if we have this big team doing all this work to take our PPP forward, there is always a risk that somehow the project starts heading off in a slightly different direction to what was originally intended. What can happen is, as the complex issues are discussed and options are presented, a team makes decisions that in isolation seem like the right decision, but slowly the project drifts away from its intended purpose. So something I think is really important is having a really clear set of project objectives and making sure everyone in that team, as they work through all these complex tasks, is always thinking back to those project objectives and saying, is what I'm doing advancing those project objectives? Are the decisions I'm making consistent with that set of project objectives?
very much indeed. Sergei and then Maurice.
Further to what other panelists said, I would just focus on one thing. I would advise not to lose sight of the partnership nature of PPPs. It's not just an outsourced contract, short-term construction of an asset. It's a lifelong journey for the project, for the public and private party. And though, let's say, a mathematical approach, calculating value for money, may look like a zero-sum game, you just shift risk, and parties may be really excited about, make the opposite party take this risk, make it more financially viable for me. In this respect, it's an adversarial relationship, but actually a good PPP should have the interests of both public and private party aligned, because they both should be interested in the success of the project. And after all, what good is the value for money calculation if a project collapses and an unfinished or problematic project anyhow lands in the laps of the public sector, and they have to pay out compensations, so on. So particularly now with the pandemic risks and everything, I think flexibility, talking more, making sure both sides are in real partnership relationship, and they care about the ultimate sustainability and success of the project.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, panel. Some fantastic questions that we've had today, and some really, really helpful, I think, meaningful and empathetic answers. So thank you very much for bringing, that empathy to the way in which we're engaging with each other today. So we're going to move to closing remarks and just hear from the panel. So Richard, if you could start us off, please, and then we'll go to Andre.
We've had a really interesting set of questions today, and I think a common theme that runs through those questions and the discussion we've had is the importance of what we call infrastructure governance. We haven't really used the term in the discussion, but ultimately a lot of the success of PPPs and getting winning outcomes from PPPs comes down to governance in terms of having the right correctly defined roles and responsibilities, accountabilities, the right decision-making processes, and also the right assurance processes to ensure that we are, in fact, all heading in that right direction and driving for a successful outcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Andre and then Amandeep.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. So the question was, or the theme of today's discussion was very relevant. Then again, I wanted to focus on the notion that we actually do have a significant number of successful projects worldwide. And what just amazes me is the width of the business that we are in. I mean, if I can use that terminology. It's from bridge PPPs to the more familiar PPPs to set. I think in some countries we've got rural satellite PPPs to be able to for people to access the internet. So just this width of use and then in social projects, it is just amazing. So I think one of our colleagues also mentioned the fact earlier today that the PPP is not the ultimate solution to every problem. It's definitely not. It's about selected projects that may fit the model very, very well. And then again, just to emphasize and stop that, is that the width is really great. We really see from the fence to where everything. So it's really a great experience. And then again, we can use those for case studies in the training that all of us do or work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andre. Amandeep and then Maurice.
Interesting discussion. So the basic point is use PPP sensibly to have a success or being a winning model. So don't just do the PPP for whatever the projects. Do it sensibly throughout the process. And for that, the advice to a smaller piece of advice to the governments to get the staff or the officials have a good capacity building, and starting point is through the CP3P course, so that the basic understanding of how what is PP the animal is and how it should work in a right fashion. They should understand. Once they understand, they will be, it will allow them to even to manage, for example, transaction advisors. Otherwise, what is happening in most of developing countries, their transaction advisors come, they build whatever the business case, submit it, nice beautiful reports, nobody reads through because they don't have that frequency. So that's very important, capacity building.
It's a really, really good point that you make there. Thank you so much, Maurice, and then Sergei.
So I'd like to remind everybody that we've been talking about the success of a PPP project, but one element of that is making sure you plan for the exit at the end of the contract. And why am I saying that? Because it doesn't matter how early on you are in your PPP process, you are going to sign a contract that's going to have all the terms and conditions about what's going to happen on exit in 25 or 30 years' time. So it's about trying to get it right. And in the UK, if I dare say this, we're coming now to the end of a number of PFI projects. And there are a number of documents that have been produced by the National Audit Office and the accounts committees and so on. And can I just recommend one, and that will then take you to the rest. It's called Managing the Expiry of PFI Contracts. It's produced by the Public Accounts Committee in March 2021. And that gives you everything you need to know.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll post a link to that in the chat. Sergei and then Suchitra.
I just echo what Amandeep was saying about importance of capacity building. These days, as we face the aftermath of the pandemic, many nations are rethinking their approach to PPPs. Many nations that they already established good frameworks and built up their capacity, they are re-educating themselves. I just wanted to note, there was a publication in the Financial Times recently about the number of people going for the CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst. The number of CFA exam takers is really going down dramatically, which is not the case for CP3P. I note that there is, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see there is any drop down in people signing up, sending their staff to learn about PPPs. I think it's mainly because nowadays it's important to build up those skills, this understanding of how PPPs would be done well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I find it's the opposite. It's accelerating, which is really, really good to see. We have tens of thousands now of people around the world accessing those qualifications and progressing towards the ultimate accolade when you've achieved the award of all three elements of it. So thank you very much indeed, Sergei. Suchitra, closing remarks for today?
It's been a great show, Nick, and thank you to our panelists and the live audience for many questions, which we will, just still pending. We'll come back and revisit the show once again.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Now, on our website, everybody, you can search for answers to almost 1,000 questions now, which is a fantastically comprehensive free resource connecting you with all of the people that you've seen on our panel today and more than 140 experts from around the world. Don't forget that you can listen to the audio versions of all the shows on your preferred podcast platform. Just search for APMG Level Up. This coming Friday on the 17th, we've got a German language show all about Service Management 5.0, which is hosted by Stefan Brendel, and that's at 2 p.m. UK or 3 p.m. European time. So if you have German-speaking colleagues, please do let them know to tune in on LinkedIn or on YouTube. Monday the 20th, then, we're going to be looking at the Project Management Office and the careers available to people. So how to become a Project Management Office specialist or a PMO specialist. And then on the Friday, the 24th, we're going to be looking at a similar approach to how to become a Data Protection Officer. Subscribe to the show and we'll send you a personal summary of what's coming up and, of course, how you can join us here on the panel and level up your career with APMG. So thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye now.